You are transported to mid-14th century England, where the air is thick with the smell of dampness, smoke, and decaying flesh. The summer sun of 1348 brings no joy, for an invisible and merciless killer is already creeping along the kingdom's roads. Your familiar notions of hygiene, safety, and comfort are instantly shattered when confronted with the harsh reality of the Middle Ages. A primal fear reigns all around, and the rustling of rat paws on the straw floor becomes a harbinger of imminent death. You don't stand the slightest chance of hiding from this catastrophe in the cozy modern world. The average person today is accustomed to clean tap water and accessible, qualified medical care. In medieval England, you'd have to drink murky sludge from the nearest river, into which tons of urban sewage and waste were dumped daily. The only treatment available, offered by a local healer, would be barbaric and exhausting bloodletting. A heavy, cloying stench of sweat and pus would envelop you from your very first days in any wooden hut. Every other person around you is doomed to a terrible death within the coming weeks. Social chaos and panic are tearing apart familiar human bonds, turning yesterday's friends into the worst of enemies. The ringing of church bells, which once summoned the faithful to peaceful worship, now sounds incessantly and ominously. The ground beneath your feet is literally saturated with poison, and the cemeteries can no longer hold the bodies of the unfortunate victims. People are fleeing their homes, leaving their livestock to die in abandoned fields under torrential rain. In this oppressive atmosphere of total collapse, you'll have to fight for every breath of air. Can you survive at least 30 days in this waking nightmare? The chronicle of this nightmare unfolds before us, with terrifying consistency and meticulous detail. The gloomy skies over the English Channel already conceal ships bearing death to millions of unsuspecting residents. Ahead of you lie grim city streets, plague-ridden barracks, and the utter helplessness of medieval science. Listen to that ominous rustling and prepare to learn the true cost of survival. The story begins right now on the southern coast, where a sinister ship from Europe is docking. This narrative will make you appreciate the blessings of modern civilization in a whole new light. Our chronological account begins on the southern coast of England on a quiet summer day. Historians know the exact date of the first outbreak, thanks to ancient records from port cities. It happened on June 24, 1348, when a merchant ship from Gascony docked at the port of Melcombe Regis. On board this ship were not only overseas goods, but also unseen carriers of a terrible infection. The sailors rejoiced at their successful return home, completely unaware of the deadly threat lurking in the holds. The coastal air, smelling of salt and rotting seaweed, was soon filled with the screams of the first dying victims. Local residents curiously scrutinized the arriving crew, noticing the sailors' strange pallor and weakness. The sound of the surf mingled with the heavy wheezing of men who could barely stand due to exhaustion. Black rats scurried unnoticed along the mooring ropes, straight onto the wooden planks of the harbor docks. The fleas clinging to these rodents were already seeking new hosts among the dock workers and fishmongers. At first, people mistook the bites for a common irritation caused by dampness and poor hygiene. No one in the port could have imagined that these tiny insects would set in motion the destruction of an entire kingdom. The symptoms of the new disease developed with alarming speed, plunging eyewitnesses into a state of shock. Literally 2 days after being bitten, a person would develop a high fever and begin to shiver. Huge, painful swellings, called buboes, grew in the groin and armpits of the victims. The tissue around these growths turned black from internal hemorrhages, giving off a putrid odor. The sick raved in their beds, and their skin became covered with dark spots. Relatives, in a panic, wiped the foreheads of the dying with vinegar. But this brought no relief. From the port districts, the contagion spread instantly to the nearby fishing villages of Dorset. The roads, washed out by frequent rains, became escape routes for terrified people who carried death further afield. Neighboring communities tried to set up armed checkpoints to keep outsiders out of their settlements. However, it was utterly impossible to stop invisible bacteria with bows and rusty swords. In the air of the rural outskirts, the scent of flowering meadows gave way to the suffocating aroma of funeral pyres. The imminent death of their neighbors forced the survivors to lock themselves in their homes and beg God for mercy. In July 1348, the epidemic reached its peak and began its merciless advance deep into the island. Local priests were the first to face the necessity of conducting funeral services for dozens of parishioners every day. Their fingers, clutching crucifixes, trembled from constant contact with the bodies of the infected. Space in the parish cemeteries quickly ran out, forcing them to dig deep mass graves. People watched in horror as carts loaded with the dead creaked through the streets every evening. The sunlight that summer seemed to the survivors like a dim and ominous harbinger of the end of the world. Fear of infection shattered centuries-old traditions of Christian charity and family support. Mothers abandoned their newborns at the first sign of ominous black spots. Husbands fled their homes, leaving their dying wives without a single sip of clean water. Dogs and pigs roamed the deserted courtyards, whining pitifully from hunger and loneliness. The entire familiar structure of village life was crumbling under the weight of indescribable horror. Lonely old people died in their beds, and there was no one to close their glassy eyes. Trade between the southern regions had practically come to a halt, depriving people of their livelihoods. The markets lay deserted, and the stalls were covered with a layer of dust and rotting fish. Merchants were afraid to touch coins, believing that the metal also carried invisible death. Prices for basic foodstuffs skyrocketed overnight, condemning the poor to starvation. The sounds of lively fairs gave way to the monotonous murmur of prayers and the weeping of orphans. Southern England sank into a state of deep torpor and paralyzing despair. Royal messengers dispatched from London described with horror what they had witnessed in the southern counties. They raced along muddy roads, trying not to stop at roadside taverns for safety's sake. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, and the riders brought only terrible news to the capital of entire villages dying out. King Edward III received these reports in his castles, but did not know how to fight this invisible enemy. All the might of the English crown proved useless in the face of a microscopic bacterium. Power and wealth no longer guaranteed protection from the widespread deadly scourge. Chronicles of those weeks preserved memories of unusually rainy and damp weather. Water flooded the basements of houses, creating ideal conditions for rodents and mold to thrive. People's clothes never dried completely. They smelled of mustiness and stale sweat. A constant cold fog shrouded the coast, seeping through the cracks in the wooden buildings. People huddled around primitive hearths, inhaling the acrid smoke of damp firewood and peat. This oppressive climate only exacerbated the psychological strain on the exhausted and terrified population. By the end of summer, the plague had drawn close to the major commercial centers in the western part of the country. The residents of Bristol gazed anxiously toward the horizon, awaiting the inevitable arrival of the Black Death. Their city walls, which had protected them from external enemies, were powerless against rats and fleas. The steady course of events inexorably led to the disease overrunning England's major economic hubs. The coming months would bring even greater suffering, as the plague swept through the overcrowded neighborhoods of the major cities. The fall of 1348 would mark the beginning of a new, even more terrifying phase of this national tragedy. With the onset of fall, the epidemic spread to major urban centers with alarming efficiency. In September 1348, the first cases of infection were officially recorded in densely populated Bristol. The city air, saturated with the smell of river silt and brewer's yeast, was filled with the moans of the dying. The streets of Bristol were so narrow that neighbors could easily infect one another through open windows. Local authorities attempted to quarantine the port, but these belated measures failed to produce the desired result. Death reaped its bountiful harvest indiscriminately among artisans, merchants, and dock workers. From Bristol, the plague bacteria spread along trade routes, straight to the heart of the English kingdom. The main target of this invisible killer was overcrowded and filthy London, home to some 50,000 people. The Black Death officially broke out in the capital around November 1st, 1348, causing unimaginable panic. Wealthy nobles immediately began packing their belongings into heavy trunks to flee to remote estates. The poor, however, remained locked in their cramped hovels, doomed to certain death. The clamor of the vast city gradually gave way to the eerie and oppressive silence of abandoned neighborhoods. The architecture of medieval London during that period facilitated the rapid spread of any dangerous infections. Wooden houses were built right up against one another, almost completely blocking out the sunlight above the cobblestone streets. Piles of rotting garbage and manure constantly accumulated in these dark and damp alleys. Sticky black mud squelched under the feet of passers-by, exuding an unbearable and persistent stench. Rats felt like the rightful masters of these places, moving freely between basements and living quarters. Anyone walking through such an alleyway inhaled the miasma of decay with every cell of their body. The living conditions inside a typical London home would seem like sheer torture to a modern observer. The rooms were tiny, dark, and almost completely devoid of proper ventilation. Families of several people slept on a single earthen floor, covered with dirty straw. For years, lice, bed bugs, and microscopic parasites of all kinds had accumulated in that straw. Clothes were washed extremely rarely, causing them to reek of sour sweat and caked-on grime. When the plague struck such a room, its inhabitants had not a single chance of survival. The rate at which London's neighborhoods were being wiped out in the fall of 1348 was beyond the imagination of contemporaries. Within a few weeks, entire streets were transformed into lifeless rows of locked and deserted houses. Huge crosses were painted on the doors of infected homes, warning the few passers-by of the danger. Cries for help rang out from behind closed shutters, but no one dared to go inside. The city markets closed, leaving the metropolis without a regular supply of fresh bread and meat. People subsisted on dried beans and salted herring, washing it all down with dubious beverages. Burial crews worked day and night at the limits of their physical and psychological endurance. These men, recruited from among criminals and beggars, collected corpses from the streets using special hooks. The bodies were dumped onto open carts like logs, taking care not to touch the black buboes. The stench of decaying flesh enveloped London in a thick, suffocating shroud that seeped into people's clothes. The corpses were hauled to the outskirts of the city, where gigantic plague pits were hastily dug. The ground in these wastelands literally quivered from the sheer number of fresh burials. By December 1348, the kingdom's judicial and administrative systems had been completely paralyzed. Parliamentary sessions were officially suspended by the king to save the lives of lords and judges. Newgate and the Tower of London had become hotbeds of the plague, where prisoners died still in their shackles. Guards abandoned their posts, fleeing for their lives into the forests beyond the city walls. Law and order gave way to primal chaos and looting in the abandoned homes of the wealthy. Religious processions attempted to appease God, but only served to further infect those who participated. The sound of church bells tolling for the dead was eventually officially banned by the authorities to preserve the sanity of the living. That incessant funeral toll drove the surviving townspeople mad with every passing minute. The city was plunged into a terrifying silence, broken only by the creaking of the wheels of funeral carts. The streets were no longer filled with the sound of children's laughter, the shouts of street vendors, or the clatter of hooves. People moved through the alleys in quick, hurried strides, pressing vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs to their noses. Each person saw in their neighbor only a potential source of agonizing death. The psychological atmosphere in London during that period resembled a protracted and nightmarish dream. Faith in a just world had finally collapsed under the weight of millions of innocent victims. Many city dwellers sank into apathy, spending their days in drunken stupors in beer cellars. Others, however, gathered in cults, awaiting the imminent arrival of the biblical day of judgment. Hope for salvation faded with every winter day that brought new reports of deaths. The frosty air of England could not stop the bacteria, which continued their terrible work beneath the rooftops. The onset of a harsh winter brought new specific challenges to the survival of ordinary people. Frozen mud on the roads hindered evacuations and the delivery of firewood to heat the remaining homes. The gradual transition from autumn dampness to winter cold exacerbated the problem of a shortage of clean drinking water. It was during this period that the full destructiveness of medieval water consumption habits in large cities became apparent. In the next section, we will examine in detail what kind of liquid the English had to drink in order to survive. The appalling state of water resources became one of the main factors contributing to the high mortality rate among the population. To fully grasp the scale of the medieval catastrophe, it is necessary to examine the living conditions of the English in detail. An ordinary resident of London or Bristol in 1348 faced appalling unsanitary conditions on a daily basis. The main problem facing cities remained the complete lack of a centralized sewer system and wastewater treatment facilities. All household waste, the contents of chamber pots, and kitchen scraps were dumped out of windows directly onto the streets. Foul-smelling streams bubbled beneath people's feet, slowly flowing toward the nearest bodies of water. This constant stench of excrement and decay was a familiar backdrop for every city dweller. Drinking water from rivers contaminated with sewage served as the main source of water for most of England's poor. The great River Thames and its tributaries were used simultaneously as water sources and as urban dumping grounds. The entrails of slaughtered animals from butcher shops and waste from tanneries were dumped into the water. Public toilets were built right on the bridges so that excrement would fall directly into the river's current. Anyone drawing a bucket of such water would see a murky suspension of hair and clumps of dirt. Consuming this liquid guaranteed regular outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid fever. Wealthy Englishmen tried to use wells, but the groundwater was also deeply contaminated. Cesspools were dug in close proximity to residential buildings and water sources. Liquid waste easily seeped through the porous soil, mixing with clean well water. This water often tasted of rot and copper, causing instant revulsion in anyone unaccustomed to it. Even boiling, the benefits of which were unknown at the time, could not purge the liquid of its toxins. People were forced to drink this deadly concoction simply to survive. The flavor of the food at that time was meant to mask the constant aftertaste of rot and decay in the ingredients. Meat and fish spoiled incredibly quickly due to the complete lack of refrigeration and preservatives. To hide the unpleasant odor, cooks generously sprinkled dishes with salt and cheap local herbs. Bread was baked from grain that was often stored in damp cellars alongside mice. Rat droppings, husks, and small pebbles from millstones were regularly found in the dough. Every meal turned into a dangerous lottery for the fragile human stomach. The sounds of medieval daily life consisted of constant coughing, retching, and the groans of suffering people. Digestive disorders were so commonplace that they were practically ignored. Chronic abdominal pain accompanied the Englishman from birth to his untimely death. People's teeth decayed at an alarming rate due to coarse food and a complete lack of oral hygiene. Swarms of fat flies buzzed everywhere, carrying disease from garbage heaps directly onto exposed food. Human physical existence under these conditions was filled with constant suffering. The medieval church regarded bodily cleanliness as a sign of sinful pride and excessive concern for the mortal flesh. A full bath in hot water took place, at best, a few times a year on major holidays. Monks and ordinary peasants wore the same coarse woolen shirt for years without washing it. The fabric became saturated with sweat and grease, turning into a stiff shell that rubbed the skin raw. Bacteria thrived in these non-healing wounds, causing constant itching, suppuration, and inflammation. People literally rotted alive long before the Black Death overtook them. Clothing was cleaned using primitive and extremely foul-smelling substances, such as lye and urine. Laundry was soaked in huge vats that reeked of ammonia throughout the neighborhood. After this process, the clothes took on a distinctive pungent odor that lingered for weeks. The laundress's hands were covered with deep chemical ulcers that never fully healed. Drying clothes in the perpetual English rain took many days, giving rise to a persistent smell of mold. Wearing such clothes would be a real ordeal for any modern person. The distinctive smell of the plague-ridden city consisted of hundreds of nauseating components blending into a single, overpowering odor. Added to the stench of sewage was the sweetish smell of fresh blood from the slaughterhouses, spilling directly onto the cobblestones. Meanwhile, the carcasses of domestic animals were decomposing right there, left unremoved from the streets for weeks on end. The smoke from burning dirty straw and tar, intended to purify the air, only stung the eyes of the townspeople. This thick, suffocating smog hung over London, seeping into the lungs of every living creature. People were suffocating in their own homes, unable to air out the rooms. Horse and human manure covered the cobblestones in a thick layer that turned into a liquid sludge on rainy days. Passers-by were forced to wear special wooden shoes with high stilts to protect their clothes. However, splashes of this toxic mud still covered people's faces and hands from head to toe. The slightest scratch on the skin that came into contact with this substance would immediately become inflamed and lead to gangrene. The medieval environment was a hostile and deadly zone for any living organism. Human helplessness in the face of this filth was absolute and unparalleled in history. All these terrifying factors created the perfect breeding ground for the rapid spread of the Black Death epidemic. The bodies of the English, weakened by poor nutrition and dirty water, had no natural immunity against the plague. When the disease struck, people rushed to seek salvation from local medieval physicians. The narrative now shifts to an analysis of the medical practices of the time, which would horrify any doctor today. In the next chapter, we will see how the dreaded practice of bloodletting was used as the primary means of fighting for one's life. With the arrival of spring in 1349, England's medical community faced the complete collapse of its theoretical knowledge. Medieval doctors, educated in the works of ancient philosophers, believed in the balance of the four humors. They attributed the plague to the air being tainted by miasmas and the unfavorable alignment of the planets in the night sky. The true nature of bacteria remained a profound mystery, sealed behind 7 seals for centuries. Consequently, all their attempts to heal the dying only served to hasten the patient's deaths. The air in the hospitals was filled with screams of terror and the stench of despair. The primary and most popular method of treatment in those dark times remained the barbaric practice of bloodletting. It was believed that removing corrupted blood would help the body restore its lost balance of forces. The physician would take a sharp, unwashed lancet and cold-bloodedly cut a vein in the arm or leg of a patient thrashing about in a fever. Dark, thick blood flowed into special copper bowls, giving off a heavy, metallic odor. A person weakened by the plague often lost consciousness right in the middle of this agonizing and futile procedure. Bloodletting completely robbed the unfortunate victim of the last reserves of strength needed to fight the deadly infection. The skin around the incisions quickly became inflamed due to a complete lack of understanding of instrument sterility. Doctors wiped their knives with dirty rags, spreading bacteria from one dying patient to another. The sounds of moaning in the plague wards mingled with the monotonous muttering of Latin prayers by the physicians. Drops of pus, blood, and vinegar-based disinfectants dripped onto the floor. Patients begged for a sip of water, but doctors often forbade them from drinking, believing it to be harmful to their fluid balance. For the patient, each such visit from a doctor became a one-way ticket to the local cemetery. The second stage of this horrific treatment involved mechanical intervention on the mature plague buboes. Doctors believed that the poison had to be released by forcibly lancing these enormous abscesses. The swellings were cauterized with a red-hot iron or cut crosswise, without any hint of anesthesia. The patient's wild screams pierced the silence of the room, and a foul-smelling black slime gushed from the wound like a fountain. The texture of this mass was thick and sticky, and it instantly triggered the urge to vomit in everyone present. The cleaned wounds were then sprinkled with powder made from dried toads, or had live pigeons placed on them. The imagination of medieval physicians in creating absurd remedies knew absolutely no reasonable limits. Patients were offered solutions of crushed river pearls mixed with molasses and expensive overseas resin. The poor, however, were forced to swallow their own urine or the ashes of burned plague-tainted clothing. The walls of houses were fumigated with smoke from incense, sulfur, and dried wormwood, making it completely impossible to breathe inside the rooms. People's eyes watered from the acrid smog, and coughing only exacerbated the ruptures in the lungs caused by the pulmonary form of the plague. All this medical spectacle unfolded against a backdrop of hundreds of corpses lying right at the thresholds of the hospitals. The plague buboes themselves grew to the size of a large apple and hardened into dense cartilage. They throbbed beneath the skin, causing the unfortunate victims hellish pain that never ceased for a single second. The patients could not move a hand or a foot, frozen in unnatural, agonizing poses. The skin over the buboes stretched taut, turned blue, and then burst open, revealing deep, festering sores. The stench emanating from these wounds caused even experienced nurses to faint from the foul odor. The entire room where such a patient lay was permeated by an atmosphere of imminent and inevitable decay of the flesh. Astrological predictions remained the main argument used by university professors to explain the causes of this unfolding nightmare. In 1349, they officially declared that the triple conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn had caused the deadly vapors. City dwellers listened intently to this nonsense, completely losing faith in earthly science and common sense. People realized that a licensed doctor knew no more about the disease than an ordinary itinerant salt merchant. Panic grew, forcing the population to trust the wildest rumors and outright charlatans. Magical amulets and spells were sold on the streets for the price of gold bars. The mortality rate among England's practicing physicians of that period was catastrophically high. Coming into contact with patients without any protection, doctors became infected within the very first days of their work. Their bodies, covered with the same black spots, were found in their offices among medical books and vials. The famous plague masks, with bird-like beaks, would not appear until the 17th century. In 1348, doctors were completely defenseless. They died side by side with their patients, demonstrating the utter helplessness of medieval science. Oxford's medical schools were emptied, having lost all their professors and students within a few months. The church attempted to offer its own spiritual remedy through mass penance and the self-flagellation of the faithful. Processions of flagellants appeared on the streets of English cities, beating themselves with whips tipped with iron. The sound of blows against bare skin and the moans of the fanatics echoed through the alleys, striking terror into the hearts of the townspeople. The blood of those participating in these processions splattered onto the walls of houses and the cobblestones, mixing with the old mud. However, these frenzied rituals only contributed to the rapid spread of plague bacteria among the huge crowds of onlookers. Religious ecstasy could not protect a person from the bites of parasites lurking in filthy rags. This whole complex of feudal treatments and wild superstitions led to terrifying statistics across the country. The average person's chances of survival dwindled with every hour spent in plague-ridden English society. The steady chronological progression of events inexorably led England to the peak of the demographic catastrophe of the summer of 1349. In the next chapter, we will examine in detail why the probability of death reached an incredible 50% of the total population. Deserted villages and massive mass graves became eternal symbols of that terrible era. The summer of 1349 marked the peak of the Black Death's deadly ravages throughout the Kingdom of England. Modern demographic studies and ancient chronicles converge on a single terrifying statistic. Every inhabitant of the island faced a grim 50% chance of death within that calendar year. The cold math meant that for every 2 people seated at a table, one was inevitably doomed to die. This terrifying reality erased the distinctions between wealthy nobles in castles and poor peasants in huts. The heir of England became an invisible guillotine, descending upon the heads of half the country's population. The scale of the rural desolation struck the rare surviving travelers with its eerie and deathly silence. Hundreds of English villages had been completely wiped out, turning into deserted ghosts amid overgrown fields. The sound of working mills and the shouts of shepherds had fallen silent forever across the expanses of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. There was no one to harvest the ripe wheat, and the ears of grain simply rotted on the stalk under the summer rains. Cows and sheep roamed the forests unattended, perishing from starvation and attacks by wild wolves. Nature was rapidly reclaiming the territories that humans had wrested from her over many centuries. The sounds of familiar village life had been replaced by the eerie rustling of the wind through the open doors of abandoned farmhouses. Inside these log cabins, on wooden benches, lay the desiccated bodies of people whom no one was left to bury. Cobwebs covered the primitive household items, and in the hearths, the gray ashes of the last fires had long since grown cold. The stench of decay wafted through the surrounding area, driving even stray dogs away from the deserted farmsteads. Anyone who happened to wander into such a village felt like the sole survivor on a devastated planet. The fear of this silence took a greater toll on the mind than the sight of exposed plague buboes. In large cities, the situation regarding the burial of the dead had completely spiraled out of the local authorities' control. Old churchyards had been dug up so many times that the bones of previous deceased were protruding from the ground. In London, new mass graves on the wastelands of Smithfield received up to 200 bodies daily. In June 1349, the corpses were stacked in layers, sprinkled with lime to accelerate decomposition and suppress the terrible stench. A sticky gray mass covered the once flourishing outskirts of the capital, turning them into lifeless deserts. The living were constantly surrounded by these gigantic factories of death right outside their windows. England's entire economic life was completely devastated by the colossal decline in the working population. Textile production, coal mining, and coin minting came to a halt due to the lack of living craftsmen in the workshops. Ships rotted at their moorings as sailors died while the ships were docked in port. Roads were overgrown with thick grass, and bridges crumbled without regular repair and maintenance. Landowners lost their fortunes, for there was no one left to pay the rent or cultivate the vast tracts of land. During that dreadful summer, money finally lost its value, giving way to a loaf of fresh bread. The state's social institutions, including the church and the courts, were undergoing a period of profound systemic crisis. The higher clergy were dying out at the same rate as ordinary parishioners in the slums. John de Stratford, Archbishop of Canterbury, died in August 1348, and his successor passed away a few months later. New priests, hastily ordained to replace the deceased, were often illiterate and did not know Latin. They were terrified of approaching the beds of the plague-stricken, depriving the dying of their last Christian comfort. The people's faith in the sanctity of the church hierarchy was finally undermined by this cowardly flight. The fabric of daily life that summer consisted of a constant dryness in the throat from the heat and the dust of the roads. The distinct taste of fear could be felt in every breath of air, saturated with the smoke of endless bonfires. People stopped planning for the future more than a few hours ahead. Families gathered in the evenings, fearfully examining each other's skin for dark spots. Any rustle behind the wall or knock on the door triggered a panic attack among the household members. Life had turned into a harsh struggle for biological survival, devoid of even the slightest signs of human joy. Against the backdrop of total extinction, the darkest and basest aspects of human nature and society came to the fore. Gangs of marauders plundered deserted castles and churches, fearing neither earthly justice nor God's wrath. They tore gold frames from icons and stripped expensive clothing from the corpses of their deceased owners. Alcoholism reached unimaginable proportions as people tried to drown out their horror with wine and strong ale. Taverns were overflowing with vagrants who were drinking away their last coins before their inevitable demise. Moral standards and rules of decorum completely dissolved in an atmosphere of universal madness and decay. Chronicles from those months recorded instances where entire monasteries were wiped out, to the last person within a week. At St. Albans Abbey, the plague claimed the lives of 49 monks, along with their abbot, in May 1349. The deserted stone halls stood, with their doors wide open, attracting only wild birds and rats. Precious manuscripts, created over centuries, lay scattered on the floor, covered with a layer of dampness and mold. There was no one left to continue keeping the historical annals, and the narrative thread in many chronicles breaks off mid-sentence. England's culture and science were plunged into deep darkness, from which it would take a very long time to emerge. By the end of August 1349, the fury of the epidemic had begun to gradually subside, leaving scorched earth in its wake. This unprecedented catastrophe claimed the lives of more than 2 million English people over the 14 months of the plague. The smooth course of history led the kingdom into a protracted period of recovering from the terrible demographic consequences. In the next and final chapter of our scenario, we will examine in detail how the devastated world changed after the Black Death receded. The altered structure of society would lay the foundation for the formation of a new English reality in the Middle Ages. The fall of 1349 brought the surviving inhabitants of England a realization of the scale of the tectonic shift that had taken place. The country, having lost half its population, could no longer exist under the old laws of feudalism. An acute labor shortage led to a radical shift in the balance of power between the lords and the peasants. The surviving farmhands and artisans suddenly realized the true value of their hard physical labor. They began to openly demand that landowners significantly raise wages and lower taxes. The old world of subjugation collapsed under the weight of empty fields and unharvested, rotting crops. Major feudal lords were forced to make concessions to the peasants in order to save their failing estates. They lowered land rents and abolished the shameful corvée labor, transforming serfs into free tenants. The taste of freedom intoxicated the common people, who for centuries had toiled for a meager bowl of soup. The sounds of village assemblies were now filled with bold speeches and demands for justice. The lords watched in horror as their centuries-old power melted away due to the lack of a docile workforce. The Black Death, unwittingly, set in motion the process of dismantling serfdom in England. The royal authorities attempted to halt this spontaneous rise in self-awareness among the lower classes through harsh laws. As early as June 18, 1349, King Edward III issued the famous Craftsman's Code, which prohibited paying wages higher than pre-plague levels. The law required all able-bodied men and women to work for the same meager wages they had received before the war, under threat of imprisonment. However, the harsh economic reality proved stronger than any royal decrees or menacing edicts. Landowners secretly violated the law, paying their laborers extra in meat, ale, and unadulterated grain to save their fields. The state apparatus of control had developed a deep crack that could not be mended by force. The landscape of post-plague England in late 1349 looked unusual and frightening to contemporaries. Vast tracts of former arable land were officially converted by the lords into pastures for sheep. Sheep farming required far fewer workers than the labor-intensive cultivation of capricious wheat. The kingdom's green hills were covered with flocks numbering in the thousands, whose incessant bleating filled the deserted expanses. Production of the famous English wool increased many-fold, laying the foundation for the country's future capitalist economy. The character of the landscape changed forever, transforming arable land into endless fenced-in pastures. The spiritual atmosphere in society, after the catastrophe of 1348, remained deeply traumatized and gloomy. The theme of the inevitability of death and the transience of life became central to English art and literature. On the walls of the surviving churches, eerie depictions of the dance of death appeared, in which skeletons led kings and beggars in their wake. The scent of incense in churches mingled with fear of the possible return of the dreaded Black Death. People became more cynical, seeking to derive maximum pleasure from life right here and now. The moral authority of the traditional church fell to its lowest point in the entire history of Christianity. The language and culture of England also underwent significant changes during this turbulent post-plague period. Due to the mass deaths of French teachers and literate monks, Latin and French lost their prominence. Beginning in late 1349, plain English began to be actively introduced in schools and courts. This led to a rapid flourishing of national literature and the emergence of great authors of a new generation. Ordinary people gained the opportunity to defend their rights in court in their native and understandable dialect. The catastrophe accelerated the formation of a unified English nation out of disparate feudal estates. In 1350, England's cities began to slowly recover, attracting peasants from depopulated villages. Sanitation laws became slightly stricter in the wake of the horrors of the Black Death. In London, fines were officially imposed for dumping waste onto the city's central streets. Butchers were prohibited from slaughtering livestock within the city walls, and slaughterhouses were moved to the riverbanks on the outskirts. The air in the cities became slightly cleaner, though it was still a long way from modern standards. People began to realize the direct link between filthy streets and the spread of deadly diseases. The skeletal remains of people from that era, unearthed by modern archaeologists, bear traces of the immense stress they endured. The bones of the survivors clearly show signs of chronic malnutrition and severe, exhausting labor. After 1349, the teeth of the English improved slightly due to a shift in their diet toward protein. The surviving poor gained access to meat, milk, and fresh cheese, which had previously been luxuries. The physical condition of the new generation improved thanks to natural selection carried out by a ruthless bacterium. History has recorded this paradoxical rise in living standards against the backdrop of a nationwide tragedy. The chronology of the post-plague decades would be marked by new, localized outbreaks of this dreadful disease. The plague returned to England in 1361, 1369, and 1374, claiming thousands more lives. However, society had already learned to respond to the threat with less panic and greater efficiency. Quarantine services and isolation facilities for visiting merchants appeared in the country's southern ports. The memory of the dreadful year 1348 was passed down from generation to generation as a major family legend. The English learned to live in the shadow of an invisible killer without losing their minds to fear. Our detailed historical overview is now coming to its logical and chronological conclusion. We have traced the entire path of the dreaded plague, from the southern ports to the fundamental restructuring of English society. Now it is time to compile all the data we have gathered into a single final summary. In the concluding section, we will answer the main question posed at the very beginning of our narrative. Why exactly would a modern person be unable to survive even 30 days in that harsh reality? As we wrap up our deep dive into the grim reality of 1348, we are left with a terrifying picture. Medieval England during the Black Death was a zone of absolute biological and social danger for humans. Your pampered modern senses would have been literally seared within the very first hours of being there. The monstrous stench of sewage, the stench of decay, and the smoke from bonfires created an unbearably suffocating atmosphere everywhere. The lack of even basic hygiene turned every daily activity into a deadly risk. Under these conditions, survival became a matter of blind luck rather than personal qualities. Drinking water from the sewage-filled rivers would instantly destroy your immune system from within. Without your usual antibiotics and filters, you would become easy prey for dysentery within the first 3 days. The barbaric bloodletting proposed by the local doctor would only hasten your inevitable and agonizing end. The terrifying buboes, throbbing beneath the skin, would cause such pain that it would be impossible to numb without anesthesia. A 50% chance of death hung over every participant in those events, leaving no room for false hope. Your body simply isn't adapted to such a hostile and filthy environment. The psychological pressure of medieval chaos would break your mind far faster than physical illness. The sight of deserted villages, mountains of corpses on carts, and the frenzied processions of flagellants would drive a person mad. The complete collapse of laws, morality, and familiar social ties created an atmosphere of primal horror. You would have to constantly hide from marauders and live in panic at the sight of any random passerby. All the power of modern civilization would prove to be a useless toy in these dark wooden labyrinths of the past. Loneliness and fear would become your only constant companions in this nightmare. Our study of history demonstrates just how fragile the well-being of modern humanity is. We've grown accustomed to taking clean water, medicine, and safety for granted. Yet history reminds us of times when humanity stood on the very brink of total annihilation. The Black Death forever changed the face of Europe, laying the foundation for modern medicine, at the cost of millions of lives. Studying these dark chapters allows us to better appreciate the achievements of science and the benefits of modern comforts. The real past reeks of blood, lime, and stale sweat, not chivalric romance. Now you know the whole truth about why you wouldn't have survived a month in England in 1348. This harsh lesson from history forces us to look at the world around us in a new light and to cherish every day we live. The scurrying of rats' paws and the tolling of funeral bells are now far in the past, confined to the pages of ancient parchments. But the memory of the great biological tragedy of the Middle Ages must live on as an eternal reminder of the power of nature. Thank you for joining us on this perilous journey with our History Channel. Take care of yourself, cherish clean water, and see you in our next videos.